Welcome everybody to the Jewish Study Center. We have a large class today. I'm expecting about 200 people. We have 100. We're almost that much right now already. 190 something. Okay, and I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I am the treasurer of the Jewish Study Center, and as such, I want to tell you that our classes are free. Our classes are also wonderful. Our instructors are really knowledgeable and good, interesting. But we have some expenses. And so we encourage people to make donations. We do not require it, but we do encourage it. If you want to make a donation, go to our website, www.jewishstudycenter.org, and click on donate, and you donate from your PayPal account or your credit card, or send a check. If you click on check, the website will tell you where to send your check. Okay, and some technical points, as you realize, this is being recorded. After the class has finished, I will delete the part that comes before me, basically, and I will upload it to YouTube and then send an email to everybody who's registered on where the recording is. Now, I'm also going to put on the closed captions. So you have closed captions or live transcript, whichever you prefer. And I will allow people to record by themselves because we record it anyway. So we don't mind that. Okay. Since everybody is muted, we do want your comments, we do want your questions. Write questions or comments in the chat box and address it to everyone. Sometimes your comment will be commented upon by other people, so it's good to have it to everyone. At the end of Rabbi Shlomo's presentation, there'll be a Q&A session, and Mindy Reiser, who was our vice president, will summarize some of your questions and ask to Rabbi Pereira, or Rabbi Shlomo, as I call him. Let me first introduce, if I can find her now. Where is Beryl? People here. Where are you, Beryl?
I'm listed as Beryl N.
Yeah, I know what you're listed as.
Okay.
Let me see if I can do that here. This is a larger class than we usually get. Oh, you should be on top. Okay. 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 There we are, Beryl. So you can introduce the rabbi.
Okay. Just so everyone knows, I'm disabled and I have a bit of a speech impediment, but I'll do my best I can. Rabbi Shlomo Periera is a native of Lisbon, Portugal, and moved to the United States in 1982. His passions, aside from Judaic studies and economics, include history and especially Iberian Jewish history. Rabbi Pereira received his rabbinical ordination in Jerusalem in 2004 and has served in the last 2 decades as assistant rabbi and education director of Chabad of Virginia. He has taught extensively in topics ranging from Jewish history and law to Jewish philosophy and mysticism, and is a founder and director of the Richmond chapter of the Jewish Learning Institute. He is the author of widely circulated research documents, and he recently co-authored Rabbi Eli Rosenfeld of Chabad, Portugal's 2 bilingual books of commentaries by 15th century rabbis from Portugal. As an economist and university professor by trade, Rabbi Pereira received his PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1987 and has been a faculty member at William and Mary since 1995, where he is the Thomas Vaughan Professor of Economics and Public Policy. His main research and teaching interests are in the area of economics of the public sector, specifically on taxation, social security reform, infrastructure policies, and environmental issues. He's been a frequent advisor to the Portuguese government and was involved in Portugal's introduction of a carbon tax in 2015. He's the author of several economic policy books and over 120 research articles in international journals. Rabbi Pereira lives with his wife, Elisheva, in Richmond, Virginia. They have 5 children, 11 grandchildren. They live in the USA and in Israel. And I had the pleasure of meeting Rabbi Pereira back in 2015 after a Jewish film festival movie on a topic of, I think, hidden Jews of Portugal. I think it was called Sepharad. Thank you so much.
Okay. Rabbi Shlomo.
Okay. So does it mean that's my turn now, right?
It is your turn completely.
Okay. So okay, so good evening to all of you, and welcome to our talk tonight about a relatively sad but extremely interesting topic, the expulsion of Jews from Portugal in 1496 and 1497, in that time period. And the question really that I wanted to address, and I hope to convince you that it's a very important question, very important issue, is why is this expulsion different from all the other expulsions? And of course, it's not by coincidence, as we'll see later on, that I'm making a little bit of a pun with the 4 questions for Passover. So why is this expulsion different from the other expulsions? The starting point of the whole approach is to understand that the last decade of the 1490s was a very important decade in Jewish history. It marked the end of a Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula, and this is something that was very far from trivial. This final chapter of organized Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula started with the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and of course people are quite familiar with that, but we are a little bit less familiar with the fact that that actually was not the end of it, and a lot of the refugees from Spain moved to Portugal. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And by 1496, 1497, so just a few years after the expulsion from Spain, we have actually an expulsion from Portugal that marked the end of, again, organized Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula. And the question is, why was this expulsion so different than all the other expulsions? Aside from the fact, obviously, that it marked the end of that very long Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. So some of the questions that we want to address are basically things that will make this case a different case. And the first question is, why is it that Portugal decided at that time to act against the Jews, given that Portugal actually had a relatively, and everything is relative, but had a relatively good reputation in terms of tolerance towards the Jewish population? That's one basic question. Another question is what exactly happened? What happened in that period, 1496, 1497? They say, okay, it was an expulsion, but actually it was much more than that and much different than that. And then we want to understand what are the ripple effects of those events in the Jewish world in general, in Portugal, of course, in the Jewish world in general, and maybe make somewhat of a link between that and the beginning of the Jewish permanent settlement in what would be the United States. So these are some of the motivating questions to show how different things are. And what I am going to do is just give you a little bit of background first, and a background not only about what things were in the Iberian Peninsula at that time, but how things evolved in Portugal and everything else. Okay, so starting by the first building block in this talk, the starting point will be this expulsion from Spain and what it meant, the aftermath of this expulsion. Now, one thing that I have to start by telling you immediately is that it's very difficult for us today to have a good sense of what the Iberian Jewry was. And the reason is because we look at the Iberian Peninsula today, the Jewish presence is minimal, and it's difficult to conceptualize, it's difficult to visualize that at the time period that we are talking about, arguably, the Iberian Peninsula was the center of the Greek world. Of course, it was not the only center, but pretty much like the United States, arguably, is one of the major centers of the Jewish world, which does not mean that there aren't Jews in other places. The Iberian Peninsula was really the center in terms of the numbers that were involved and in terms of the quality of the contributions, not only in terms of Jewish law and history, but also in terms of the secular sciences and just the society in general. And just to give you a sense of where things were in Portugal, in 1492, before the major inflow of refugees from Spain, the Jewish population in Portugal was about 8% of the total population of the country. 8%. This is something we don't find any place in the world now. In Spain, was even more than that. So arguably, the Spanish population at the time, the Jewish population could be 10, 15% of the total population. Again, a very, very large number of people with a very visible and very highly, very wonderful contributions to everything in society, not just the Jewish society. So this is to give you magnitude of what we are talking about. We are talking about, again, something that is very much in the core of Jewish life at the time. And we have to understand or try to grasp what the expulsion from Spain meant in terms of the Portuguese Jewry. The expulsion from Spain had an absolutely enormous impact on Portuguese life in general and Portuguese Jewish life. First of all, because the population went from a little bit under 100,000 Jews at the time to more than twice that. The Jewish population of Portugal is estimated in the aftermath of the expulsion from Spain to be about 200,000 Jews. And this means that it was about 20% of the population of the country. 20%, 20. So there was an absolutely massive presence in Portugal. And again, because many of the refugees from Spain went to other places. But many of the refugees from Spain naturally just crossed the border into Portugal, in particular because Portugal had a very good reputation of not mistreating the Jews by and large. And again, everything is relative, but the reputation was a reputation of relative tolerance. So the number of Jews in Portugal at this time is staggering, 20% of the population. But it's not just the numbers, it's the qualitative importance. And I want to give you just two examples that will tell you, can call them case studies, that will tell you how important the Jewish community was in Portugal at the time. Again, mind you that at this particular moment, I'm talking about Portuguese Jewish community just to make life easy for me, because what we have really is the Portuguese community with an overwhelming presence of Spanish refugees. So at this time, the Portuguese Jewish community was actually Portuguese and Spanish Jewish community. Okay, so let's make sure that we understand that. The first case study that I want to introduce to you is the case of Rabbi Abraham Zacuto. Rabbi Abraham Zacuto was a refugee. He left Spain in 1492 and went to Portugal. He is a very famous mathematician. He is an astronomer, a historian, and he made very decisive contributions to the scientific life at the moment. At that time, and this is something we are going to come back to for a variety of reasons, this time period in European history was characterized by the fact that with the Ottoman Empire having conquered the Constantinople and basically a good part of Europe, the trade routes, the land trade routes into Asia were completely disrupted. So the name of the game at that time was to find maritime routes, around the African continent to reach Asia and have access to the markets of all the important things that you could get from Asia, mostly spices. So these created a huge problem, technically speaking, and I'm talking about a scientific issue. The problem is that to go to the southern horn of Africa and go into Asia, for a variety of reasons, you have to navigate in high seas. High seas, not close to the coast, which was the typical. So the major challenges that existed from a scientific perspective at the time was exactly to allow the navigation in high seas, which needed the GPS of the time. And Rabbi Zacuto provided the GPS of the time in the form of a table of astronomical events that could orient people just looking at the sky, because it's pretty much the only thing that they could do is look at the sky if you are in the high seas. And he also developed a very special type of an astrolabe that can be used in the ocean, and it can be used at night, because during the day it's difficult to just look straight at the sun for obvious reasons. So he developed these important contributions that really solved the technical problem and allowed these maritime expeditions. And in 1493, Rabbi Zacuto, he is the head mathematician of the crown, the Portuguese crown. He is the chief astronomer of the crown. He is the person that is telling the crown what can be done and what cannot be done. These are documents that actually are payments and appointments of Rabbi Zacuto by the Portuguese crown, and the image at the bottom is actually his signature as saying that he received some of these payments. And he is absolutely fundamental, Rabbi Zacuto, in the process of Portuguese discoveries. He is the one that gives the technology, the scientific technology in terms of the navigation, in terms of tides, ocean tides and so forth, all that information that allows the voyage of Vasco da Gama, the very famous voyage at the time. And so again, it's a very important character, very important scientific contributions. This in the middle is actually a tapestry that exists in a museum in Portugal. And this tapestry shows Rabbi Zacuto, which is circled, Rabbi Zacuto showing to the crown, showing to the king a few days before the departure of Vasco da Gama for India, showing the Almanac Perpetuum, that is all the tables and all the scientific information. Now, just in case you think that I'm exaggerating about the importance of Rabbi Zacuto, and that would be time for another discussion in and of itself, it's enough to tell you that Rabbi Zacuto, is the only Jew that I'm aware of that has a crater in the moon named after him. That is Zacut crater. Okay? That's how important he is at the time in terms of his contributions. The other case study that I want to share with you is the printing press and the importance, the overwhelming importance of the printing press in Portugal at the time, that was made possible mostly, again, by the enormous Jewish presence, and in particular, all these, the refugees from Spain. This was a typical case, again, where printing in Portugal is mostly introduced by Spanish refugees, Jewish refugees from Spain that bring with them the printing press. And the history of printing in Portugal started a few years before, in 1487. The first book that is printed in Portugal is actually the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. It's not the first Hebrew book. It's the first book that was printed in Portugal in any language. And this is the first page and the last page of the book. During this period, the Hebrew printing press went from this Pentateuch and until 1496, so about the time of the expulsion, and the very last book to be printed in the Hebrew presses was the Almanac Perpetuum, that is this compendium of information for navigation that was developed by Rabbi Abraham Zacuto. This is very interesting in many different aspects, but for the moment, it's enough to say that in Portugal, during this period, and I'm talking about a very short period of time, there were 3 printing shops, Hebrew printing shops, when basically there was nothing else. There were no other printing shops for quite a while. There was one in Faro, that is in the southern part of Portugal, that was run by a Spanish refugee. There was one in Lisbon that was run by another Spanish refugee, this one coming straight from a printing house in Spain. And there was another one in Leiria, again with a family that was originally from France and the refugees from Spain. And these are just some of the books that they printed. Now, to give you an idea of how important things were, and the Hebrew printing was in Portugal, in terms of the printing press in general, these are just some basic facts. The first book to be printed in Portugal was a Hebrew book. The first book printed in Lisbon was a Hebrew book, and happened to be also the second book printed in Portugal in any language. Was a Hebrew book printed in Lisbon, was the commentary by Ramban, by Nachmanides on the Torah. Arguably the most important Portuguese incunabula, and incunabula are just printings before the 1500s with the new printing press, was from a Hebrew printing house. The first scientific book printed in Portugal, and actually arguably in the Iberian Peninsula, was printed in the Hebrew press in Portugal. There were 15, we know about 15 incunabula plus 1 Gothic incunabula that were printed by the printing houses, the Hebrew printing houses in Portugal. Okay, of the 15 Hebrew books that we know, 5 of them were first world editions. 5 of them. The production of the Hebrew printing press from this period of 1487 to 1496, barely a decade, this is 2/3 of all Portuguese production of printing books. 2/3. So what am I saying? am I saying that the presence, the Jewish presence in Portugal at this time was absolutely overwhelming, not only in terms of number, but in terms of contribution. These are just two examples. Now, where do we go from these that just sets up the stage to what happened to have a situation in which the Portuguese crown in particular turned against the Jewish people? So what is the Portuguese problem in general, and what is the Portuguese Jewish problem in particular? I am not going, for all obvious reasons, to go through these genealogies with you, but what I want to tell you with these is that the crowns of the Iberian Peninsula, and there were different crowns at the time. It was not just Portugal and Spain. There was Portugal, that was Aragon, that was Castille, it was Navarra, it was, again, several crowns. And this is a period, obviously, of the famous or infamous Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. And what I'm trying to show with this is that all this family, they were related. They were completely related. They were cousins with a certain distance. They were all related back to an older king in Portugal. They were all family. And one of the things that all of them were obsessed was to unify the Iberian Peninsula in one crown, just under one crown, right? So at the time you could have 4, 5, 6 different kingdoms, and then eventually you end up with Portugal and Spain just 2. And some people will say, well, how come that Portugal was not absorbed into everything? That's a different story in and of itself. But the point is that through marriage alliances, they were completely obsessed with unifying the country, and they had all types of fighting associated with that, military wars. And the king of Portugal, so that is this one right here, King John, he had a son, Afonso, and he was able to get his son, Afonso, married to Isabel. And Isabel, as you can see, is one of the daughters, actually the oldest child of the Catholic kings of Spain. Okay, so far so good. This was obviously a step in the direction, intended a step in the direction of unifying the crowns. That was great. The problem is that Afonso, the heir to the throne, died. He died at a freak horse accident, and therefore there was no heir to the throne. Basically, the throne then is inherited by King Manuel, who is a cousin of the previous king and actually a brother-in-law. Again, they were all related. And the thing that's really interesting here is when the previous king dies and King Manuel comes to the throne, the first thing that he starts doing is, again, for the sake of unifying the kingdom, what he wants to do is he wants to get married to Isabel, meaning he wants to get married to the widow of his nephew. Okay, so what? Well, there is a big problem here. There is a big problem. The moment he was crowned, he started negotiations, but the bride and the parents of the bride were very reluctant, because keep in mind that Spain had just basically picked off the Jews in 1492. The Muslims were controlled. There were Muslims there. They were never expelled, but they were defeated. So it was pure, completely great. It was just Christian blood, as if it were. Everything else was irrelevant. And they were not happy with the idea that Portugal had welcomed all these Jews, the refugees. And in particular, Princess Isabella, the daughter, it seemed that together with the parents, she was very devout and very fanatic and very whatever. And she attributed all the problems in her life, namely the fact that the husband died so young in a freak accident, and the father-in-law died so young as a king as well. All of that she attributed to the fact that Portugal was very soft on the Jews. The punchline of the whole thing, because we don't need to go through many more details, is that the condition, the explicit condition for this marriage was Portugal get rid of the Jews. So the condition that was put by the Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabel, and in particular the daughter, the bride-to-be, was if you don't get rid of the Jews, then there is no marriage. So eventually, King Manuel decided to expel the Jews for the sake of the wedding. An agreement was reached towards the end of 1496. And this is interesting. The official agreement for the marriage is dated of November 30th, 1496. And 5 days later, okay, King Manuel, he promulgates the decree of expulsion of Jews from Portugal. So, I mean, very clearly related. The marriage actually only takes place in the following year, but this is basically what the situation that you have here. The king is being pressured, and he decides to get rid of the Jews. There is a problem here, though. There is a problem, and there is a footnote. There is a problem, and there is a footnote. Let me start with the footnote and then go to the problem a little bit more. The footnote is that the request, the initial request, was from the Catholic kings of Spain and Aragon and Castille for this marriage to take place, was for Portugal to get rid of Jews and Muslims. It was actually very easy for Portugal to negotiate away this idea of getting rid of the Muslims. Why? Because the Muslims were not expelled from Spain. They were there. But more importantly, the argument that won the day was that if we give a hard time to the Muslims, the citizens, Muslim citizens, then we are going to expect that in the places where Christians are living in Muslim countries, that there will be retaliations. So it's a very interesting argument, and my pitch, my sales pitch about that is, it just tells you how important it is, or it would have been, for Jews to have their own state, their own home. Okay, if we have our place, our own home, Israel, as thank God we have today, things could have been very different. Not because we were going to threaten the Christians there. I mean, of course, we don't have that that type of attitude. But just not having any power made a huge difference. So that's sort of the footnote. The problem that we want to consider is that, yes, the King of Portugal wanted to get rid of the Jews. He needed to get rid of the Jews. However, he really did not want to get rid of the Jews at the same time. He wanted to keep them. All the advisors suggested that. All the big assemblies that were summoned, people were constantly telling him, don't do that, because if you're going to expel the Jews, you're going to lose what? This is the beginning of the golden era for Portugal. It's the beginning of all the exploits and the maritime empire and everything. If you are going to expel the Jews, you're expelling people like Abraham Zacuto. You're expelling people that are giving the science behind all this stuff. You're going to expel the artisans that have the know-how on how to build caravels. You are going to have to expel people that are financing this whole thing, by heaven's sake. So expelling the Jews is a pretty bad idea. We need them. We're not going to be able to form this empire. You're just not going to be able. Technically, technologically, scientifically, and financially. You're not going to be able to do it unless you have the Jews. So obviously, the king has a very serious problem here. Very serious problem. He needs to get rid of the Jews, and yet, at the same time, he needs to keep the Jews. This is the Portuguese problem. This is the Portuguese Jewish problem. How do I get rid of the Jews and at the same time keep them? What was the solution that was found? Let's see. The let me describe a little bit, and this we get to something that is goes to the core of the question already of why this expulsion is so different from the other expulsions. The solution that eventually the Crown came up with, it was a solution actually that was suggested by a renegade Jew, to the best of our understanding. Anyway, a solution basically was, if you want to get rid of the Jews, but at the same time you want to keep them, basically the only thing you have to do is convert them by force. Just convert them, force them to convert, and then you keep them, but they are not Jews anymore. So you sort of keep the Jews, but you get rid of the Judaism. So it's Judaism-free Jews. So just convert them. And that's basically what the Crown did systematically. So, for example, right after the decree of expulsion, a couple of weeks after Hanukkah of the same year, there was a first wave of massive conversions. And what we are talking about is literally mostly children. At this stage was mostly children under a certain age. And the basic idea is if you kidnap the children and if you convert the children, then the parents are not going to leave because they are not going to leave the children behind. So it's, and when we talk about the conversion of children, the kidnapping of these children, this was in a very large scale, and you're talking about not just the common mortals, the common Jews, but the big rabbis, their children were kidnapped. And so the first wave of mass conversions was in Hanukkah of that year. During Passover of that year, and please note that the authorities, the Christian authorities, they were pretty familiar with the Jewish holidays, and they wanted to make sure that they would celebrate those holidays by forcing Jews to convert. So on Passover of 1497, so a few months after, again, a massive process of conversion. Now children under 14. It started with children under 14. Next, you're talking about children under 21, which arguably is not children anymore. But you're talking about, again, completely taking away the young generation, kidnapping the first generation. In the meantime, there is something that that happened that's very interesting, is that with the decree of expulsion, the decree of expulsion was a very devious document in many perspectives, because essentially it says, look, guys, if you want to leave Portugal by land, please feel free. Just go, wherever you want. But if you want to leave by sea, the Crown, I will make sure that you have boats before the due date in 3 major ports in Lisbon, Porto, and Setúbal. You have boats there that will take you. They have vessels. We, the Crown, will make sure that you have those vessels. Now, notice that if you just look at the map of the Iberian Peninsula, you know that the only place you can run away from Portugal by land is go back to Spain, which of course was not an option. So basically that means that the Jews could only live by ocean, by the sea, and there were 3 ports, 3 harbors that were assigned for these, and everything was in the hands of the Crown. It's not as if we could start just hiring vessels and things like that. So what happened is that when it gets to October of 1497, so this is basically a month after the marriage takes place, Jews were summoned to Lisbon because the deadline for the expulsion was getting closer and closer. They were summoned, they were promised boats, and we know now there are many records of what happened at that time, both from Portuguese sources and Jewish sources. We know that we had a very large number of people in downtown Lisbon, a very large number of Jews. It was to the point that people had to find places to stay outside Lisbon already. That's how many people were coming. The estimates are around 20,000, 30,000 people that were there. And people were just gathered downtown Lisbon, and they were starved for 3 days, no food, no water, no nothing. The only thing that they got during those 3 days was conversionist speeches by the clergy and by some renegade Jews. And basically, after the 3 days, you have some of the clergy sprinkling holy water over the crowds and thereby making everybody officially Christian. Which means, essentially, that what started as an expulsion, and when we have a lot to say about that, but what started apparently as an expulsion morphed very fast into something completely different. It morphed very fast into massive conversion by force. And by massive, you're talking about a few 100,000 people. It's basically the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population in Portugal at the time. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but how many people were really expelled? The accounts from the time are that maybe there are between 88, number 8, and 40 people that actually ended up being expelled. And they were mostly deported because they would face death rather than convert. Very small number of people, and again, you have lots of documentation about what happened. We have lots of evidence and discussions and reports of the time about people in downtown Lisbon committing suicide with and killing the families, not to allow themselves to be converted. So it was a very gruesome picture. But the point of the whole thing is that you now have, by October of 1497, what you have, broadly speaking, is those 200,000 Jews. Again, broadly speaking, the 200,000 Jews now suddenly, the overwhelming majority have been baptized by force. They were officially Christians now. And there was a lot of consideration in terms of how to deal with them, because, this is the first problem. The first problem is that everybody knows that those people that were just converted by force, that now are referred to officially as new Christians, everybody knows that they don't know the first thing about Christianity. So even if they want to be devout Christians, they don't know. So what did the Crown do? The Crown decided to give a period of about 20 years that was then extended a little bit more. What we could call a don't ask, don't tell policy means the Crown would be, and the different authorities would be very tolerant to the fact that people were really not being very good Christians because they really didn't know what they were doing. So there was an expectation that they would participate and be attending church and all those types of things. It was understood that they were used to do other things and they didn't know really much yet about Christianity. So it was, again, a grace period, if you want to adjust, and people would not be questioned on their practices. That's part of the legislation that was constantly reenacted for the next 50 years or so. Another very important piece of legislation is, at that time, is basically to make it illegal for people to leave the country. The new Christians, the Jews, not only were not expelled, but they were forbidden to leave. Because you can say, well, look, at the time, traveling was not easy. We understand that. But, I mean, people under these conditions, they are trying to flee, to try to run away. Now, the problem is that either you go the whole family, or if you go just one or two of them, you're putting the family in jeopardy. It's like what is happening in North Korea these days, right? I mean, even if one person leaves, then your family is going to pay for it. So what we have here is a situation in which, yes, it's true, a number of people managed to flee. And exactly because of that, the Crown was very unhappy about it, because these people, we wanted them to stay. But of course, look, obviously, these were not very happy campers. The Jewish population, now the new Christian population, this massive number of people, they were not happy campers, obviously. So if you feel strongly about your traditions and your religion and everything, which of course you do, because this is just the cream of the crop of Iberian Jewry now at this stage, after so many decades already of persecutions in Spain and so forth, you're not going to be happy, so you're going to try to leave. And many people did. And so these laws were introduced and repeatedly reenacted, forbidding Jews to new Christians to leave the country on the grounds that the family would be persecuted and all their belongings would be confiscated. So what is so different then about the final solution of this Iberian problem in Portugal? With the Portuguese expulsion, were Jews expelled from Portugal? No, they were not. Jews were not expelled. Very few actually left at the time. I mean, then it trickled over time. But what happened was that the Jews of Portugal were forced to convert. In many cases, they were even converted just by having holy water, so to speak, being sprinkled upon them. It's not as if they are even being asked if they want to. And so they are converted by force. They are forbidden to leave. There is no expulsion. There is no expulsion. You're converted by force. You're a new Christian now. You cannot leave. And you can sort of lapse a little bit because we understand that you're not very good at these things. This is the beginning of the new Christian, so-called new Christian phenomenon. And this immediately tells you how different this expulsion is from other expulsions. The truth is that there was no expulsion. Judaism was expelled. Judaism was expelled. The Jews were not. And there is a very interesting reflection that I want to give to you here, because just to show how different this expulsion was, and just to show that expulsion was never the idea. The idea was always to convert the Jews by force. First of all, because you needed the Jews, because of all the reasons that we talked about. But everything that happened, for example, control of the ports, the fact that people could only leave through 3 different ports, and it was everything controlled by the crown. This was done on purpose, not to allow people to leave. More importantly, there is something that was overlooked for a long time in terms of the research, and people didn't really realize that, is that a few days after the decree of expulsion, a few days after, something happened that is so unique to this expulsion. And that is, there was an order to immediately dismantle all the Jewish organizations, all the Jewish communities. 1 or 2 weeks after the decree of expulsion, and months before Jews were expected to leave, synagogues were closed. Jewish charities were closed. Everything that was ritual objects was stolen from the Jews. Public property, private property. The books, Hebrew books, were all taken away from the Jews. We know that the Hebrew books were put in storage in some, for example, the great synagogue of Lisbon that was closed as a synagogue became a storage area of Hebrew books and the ritual objects. As a matter of fact, soon thereafter, the great synagogue of Lisbon was offered in a trade, and that's a different story we don't need to go through, but it was offered in a trade to the Catholic Church. So it became a church that still exists today. It's not the same building, but it's a parish and a church that exists to this day. So this is very unique. You don't have that in any other country. You don't have that in Spain. In Spain, you have the decree of expulsion in January, but between January and August, Jews could do their thing. the institutions were not closed. So synagogues were still functioning. I mean, people were not very happy, obviously, but synagogues were functioning. Everything was functioning. So it was a very different situation with this massive, immediate destruction of Judaism. People could still be there, but Judaism was taken away from them, not when the decree of expulsion was supposed to be effective in October of 1497, but just a week or two after the decree of expulsion itself. We know, these are not vague things. We know, we can trace some of the things. The cemeteries were desecrated. The cemeteries were closed. We know that a lot of the stones from the cemetery, the Jewish cemeteries, were taken and were used in the building of what would be the first major hospital in Lisbon. That was the All Saints Hospital. We know that. It's documented. We know the property that was the books and other things that then were sold and to make money for the crown. And so we can go a long way through that, but what I'm trying to point out here is that from the beginning, this was not an expulsion. This was expulsion of Judaism, but not of the Jews. You get rid of Judaism, but you keep the Jews. That was the compromise. That was the very smart and intelligent and yet an amazingly cruel solution that the Portuguese crown found to their problem. Keep the Jews, take away the Judaism from them. Not just keep them, but make them stay. They cannot leave. So what is the aftermath of this? The ripple effects of this are enormous. The immediate aftermath, you have a whole flurry of legislation. Throughout the next 20, 30 years, you have one piece of legislation after the other, basically giving grace periods to the Jews, making sure that they were not allowed to leave the country, continuous legislation indicating that this was a continuous problem. People were trying to flee. And there are two events that I think we can identify that maybe they marked the end of all hope. They basically meant the end of all illusions for the Portuguese Jews, new Christians, for what is left of these Iberian Jews. One was a pogrom, a massacre of Jews in 1506. Downtown Lisbon, that's again a fascinating event in and of itself. Several thousand Jews, new Christians, were slaughtered on Easter Sunday, because that actually happened to be the second day of Passover. And they were accused, I mean, the population were really absolutely furious because they seemed to be observing Passover still the day before. And they are doing that on top of Easter, how frustrating that is. And just to understand the animosity of the overall population against the new Christians, against the Jews, you have to understand that the anti-Semitism, if you want, is much greater now than it was before. That seems to be amazing, because now they are Christians officially. And they are hated even more. Why? Why? Because now, as Christians officially, they don't have any of the restrictions that they had before. As Jews, they could not be doing this and that and that. Okay, now they can do everything. So basically, these people that were the great brains, the great monies, the great everything, what do you think they did? They availed themselves to all the opportunities. In the beginning of the 1500s, you have 6 merchant houses in downtown Lisbon that controlled the whole trade, the whole European trade. Of those 6 houses, at least 4 of them were new Christians. So basically, the massive population, what they were saying is that these guys that now are new Christians, they don't do anything Christian. They are still desecrating Christianity. They are still doing their Jewish stuff because of this don't ask, don't tell stuff. And in addition to that, they can now do everything that they could not do before. And they are much better off financially and economically than they were before. What is there not to like about that? So the anti-Semitism was violent, very violent at that time, and many thousands of people, of Jews, were killed in a popular rampage just because they dared to make some comments. Some Jews stupidly make some comments in a church where they were attending Easter services, and they make some remarks about some rays of light that were coming into the church, and the Christians were all hyper because that was a miracle, because the rays of light were inciding in one of the statues of Jesus, and everything was such a miracle, and I don't know what. And one of the stupid Jews had the stupid idea of saying, what do you mean it's a miracle? I mean, you have a window there, you have the ray of light coming. It's just basic things. What do you mean it's a miracle? Yeah. That ended up with a few thousand people slaughtered later on. So that was the beginning, that was the end of hope. The other was a few years later, in 1537, when finally, I didn't say finally compared to Spain, but the Tribunal of the Holy Inquisition was introduced. It took some time. But by 1540, that was when the first auto da fe, the first public burning of Jews, new Christians, occurred. Because now, of course, they were not burned as Jews; they were burned on grounds that they were not good Christians. Which is interesting. One of the most misunderstood things, and again, conversation for some of the time, is that the Inquisition actually had absolutely no jurisdiction over Jews. The Inquisition only had jurisdiction of Christians. So these people were victims of the Inquisition because they were officially Christians and they were not very good Christians. That was sort of the excuse. For you to have an idea of how far it goes, there was a big debate in the church at the time about the idea of whether or not forced conversions to Christianity are valid, because it's supposed to be a voluntary act, but this is hardly voluntary. And the Inquisition fathers, the Dominicans and the other monastic orders that were behind the Inquisition, they lobbied very fiercely in favor of recognizing these forced conversions as voluntary enough to be valid, because otherwise they would not have jurisdiction over those people. So again, interesting. But those are the short-term ripple effects. The long-term ripple effects are enormous. This is the beginning of a huge diaspora. A huge diaspora. In the beginning, in the 1500s, it was mostly a diaspora of Jews living from Portugal and Spain, but mostly from Portugal at this stage. And again, Portuguese Jews, Portuguese New Christians are now, it's Iberian, really, Jews and New Christians. North Africa, Italy, Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire actually conquered the land of Israel in 1515. And at that time, the Jewish presence of refugees in the land of Israel was enormous. I mean, enormous. Just think about the city of Tzfat in the 1500s, the city that produces Rabbi Yosef Karo is there. He's the one that writes the Shulchan Aruch. He's the one that basically sets the terms of Jewish law until now. Where did Rabbi Yosef Karo come from? He came from Portugal. The family came from Spain. That's where he was. The chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi Ibn Habib. Where did he come from? He came from Portugal. He was a refugee from Portugal. As a matter of fact, he was not just a refugee. He was someone, when he was 17 years old, the great Rabbi Ibn Habib, 17 years old, in 1497, he was converted by force. He lived as a Christian for a couple of years before he managed to leave. And he became the great chief rabbi of Jerusalem. all the Kabbalists from Tzfat, where did they come from? They come from the Iberian Peninsula. They were Portuguese and Spanish refugees. You had throughout, not just Israel, but throughout the Ottoman Empire, throughout Italy, the congregations that you had there, they were named after the places where people came from. So you have a community of people that came from Castille originally, other people that came from Seville, Castille originally, others came from Portugal and from Lisbon. That's how they were known. Just in Tzfat, in the middle 1500s, according to the Islamic census, they have basically census to know people would pay taxes. Just at that time, there were probably 4,000 or 5,000 Jews that came from Portugal. And these are the ones that came from Portugal later. These are the ones that were forcibly converted. These are not the people that came before, because you had a few other thousand of other people that came before. So it's a massive presence all over the place, including Israel. The whole Jewish community in Israel was revitalized at that time with the minds, the money, the energy of the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish refugees. Then after 1580, you start having lots of Jews running away, new Christians running away to Holland and other places. But this is mostly the eastward exile routes. Again, North Africa, Italy, Ottoman Empire, and Holland. Later, you start having a big flow after Holland. Is a very big story in and of itself. But when people start going to Holland, it's not a coincidence that they start going to Holland around the 1580s or so, because that's actually when Spain occupied Portugal. And at that time, Spain was in war with Holland and other areas. So basically, running away to Holland was a way of running away to the enemy and getting completely out of basically the auspices of the Inquisition in some way, of Portuguese or Spanish authorities. So people go to Holland. Lots of people running away to Holland. And then, so something very interesting, because Holland attacked and conquered some of the Portuguese and Spanish possessions in South America, Brazil in particular. Brazil was run by the West Indies companies and other companies at that time, the Dutch Brazil, the time of Dutch Brazil. And it's a time that you have a major inflow of Portuguese Jews going to Brazil. So what do you have? You have Jews, new Christians that go from Portugal to Holland at this time, late 1800s, early 1600s, go to Holland. And then when Holland takes over part of Brazil, they go to Brazil, naturally. It's a part of Portugal before, so they go. Again, to cut a very long story short, and this is in and of itself would be a fabulous topic of discussion for a whole class, would be what happens is when Portuguese reconquers Brazil, the Jews that had left Portugal and went to Holland, and from Holland went to Brazil, the Dutch Brazil, now are stuck with the Portuguese and the Inquisition again. And 23 of them in 1654, 23 of them left Pernambuco and went to New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam, of course, is now New York. And those are the first 23 permanent Jewish settlers in what would be the United States, are 23 Portuguese Jews, new Christians that were refugees from Portugal, then to Holland, from Holland to Dutch Brazil, and then from Brazil to New Amsterdam. And again, keep in mind that New Amsterdam was under the auspices of the West Indies Company. So you're basically going to the next location where you could be still under the same auspices. The whole story of these 23 refugees is very interesting, but it just tells you the deep connection that all of these has, even with the Jewish presence in the United States, what is now the United States. So the other big consequence of these, aside from this enormous diaspora, Sephardic diaspora throughout the times, and incidentally, this diaspora lasted, this constant flow of refugees lasted until the early 1700s. That later, you're talking about over 200 years. But the other effect is that these conditions led to the birth of a massive, large-scale phenomenon that we could call crypto-Judaism. And crypto-Judaism is people that were doing some Jewish things to the extent of their ability, but officially they could not be Jewish. Notice that the uniqueness of the Portuguese case allows the creation of this crypto-Judaism to an extent that no other expulsion would allow, and certainly the expulsion from Spain did not. Why? Because the Jews in Portugal in 1496 and 1497, they were given 20 years and then more as grace period to adjust to their new faith. What do you think they did? They adjusted their old faith to the secret, to the secrecy that was necessary now. So lots of things were lost immediately. I mean, you cannot have Hebrew names and circumcisions and things like that. You cannot have public observance of Shabbat. You cannot have dietary laws and all those things. So, but whatever you could keep in secret, it was kept in secret. Now, what you can imagine is that if you go one generation and the second generation and the third generation, what you are passing now is a very distorted view of Judaism. So it's crypto-Judaism. It's a Judaism of the heart, if you want, but it's a very distorted version of Judaism. These phenomena of crypto-Judaism, this massive phenomenon, also led to a huge problem when these communities throughout the world, throughout Europe, throughout America, and so forth, they tried to absorb, to reintegrate these refugees. This is the phenomenon of the penitents, the Baal Teshuvah, which was a heartbreaking phenomenon at the time, especially in the earliest period, the 1500s, because again, these are people that were converted to Christianity by force. Now, after some time, they really don't know what they are doing anymore. In some cases, they have to get married outside the faith. God knows what they were doing. Now they run away from Portugal and they want to be reintegrated in the Jewish community. What should we do? How should the Jewish communities react to this? And you have what you could describe as a mixture of compassion and condemnation. So on one hand, people understood that this was a difficult situation. On the other hand, people didn't have a lot of sympathy because you betrayed your faith. Now that you betrayed your faith, I mean, okay, we understand because you were forced. But then you stayed there and you benefit from the situation for a couple of decades before you decided to leave. So the mix of compassion versus condemnation, as time went by, became more and more negative. Because again, you say, well, are you guys victims or you're basically traitors? What are you? So this created a huge heartbreaking problem in the Jewish world at the time that had the ripple effects throughout a couple of centuries, and in many respects still has some ripple effects today. So some final thoughts to wrap things up. So why is the expulsion from Portugal different from the other expulsions? Well, I guess now we would know the answer. There was no expulsion. You have a massive process of forced conversion. You have people that were prohibited from leaving the country and were given an opportunity to adjust to their new faith and develop whatever. And this is happening in what is the core of Jewish life. This is the core of Jewish presence in the world at the time. That is the Iberian Peninsula. This is not in the fringes of Judaism. This is happening in the core, where the Jewish population was not just massive, but had an enormous influence in everything that was around. So this is a turning point in Jewish history. It's a paradigm shift. It's such a critical turning point in Jewish history. And of course, we are not talking just about the expulsion from Portugal. What we are talking is about something that is the end of the Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. A presence that is over 1,000 years old. Very ancient presence. Okay, it predates the Romans, predates the Common Era. It was the end of organized Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula, and in particular in this point, a place where Judaism was the center of Judaism. So it's a paradigm shift. It's the end of an era. It leads to an enormous number of people that were converted by force, which means that they didn't want to be Christians. They were forced to do it. It leads to this widespread phenomenon of crypto-Judaism that has rippled effects to all these communities for centuries. Even as late as the 1700s, the early 1700s, you have refugees from Portugal going to London. That was the big area receiving refugees at the time was Hamburg in Germany and London. And it's fascinating how many people, the thousands of people, literally thousands of new Christians that ran away from Portugal at that time, the first 3 or 4 decades of the 1700s. And it's fascinating why they were able to do that at that point. But it basically, to cut a long story short, they were able to do that at that point because Portugal had a free trade agreement with England, very old treaty, one of the oldest commercial treaties. And according to that free trade agreement, the boats, the ships, the commercial vessels were not inspected because there were no border fees. There were no taxes. It's a free trade zone. So there was no inspectors, which allowed everybody to board the boats and leave. And it was a massive, you have records of people that were going to the Jewish communities in London, and how much of a difficulty it was. And as a matter of fact, also how from England at that time, the Jewish community made an effort to start sending Jewish groups to America, to Georgia, to Savannah, to other places, because they didn't have the resources to deal with people, with all these refugees in England at the time. But we have to understand also that it's very important that these people 200 years after, the notion of Judaism is very different from mainstream. We know that these stage people, these Jews, they were leaving Portugal to be Jewish. And then they would go to the Jewish community, the Bevis Marks synagogue, in the very famous Bevis Marks Sephardic synagogue in London. On Shabbat and on Sunday, they would go to the Catholic Church or to the Anglican Church, because that's what they were doing to do. They didn't do any different. So a very constant flow of refugees. Then we have to recognize also that the end of Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula marked the beginning of Jewish life in many other areas. It was the beginning of very large Jewish communities throughout the Ottoman Empire, including Israel. Eventually, that's how Judaism spreads to South America. It's how Judaism spreads to North America. So it was an end, but it was an end that fertilized, if you want, lots of beginnings of new Jewish communities in many other places. And it's important to mention that although this is more from a Jewish perspective that we are interested to talk about this, the flow of refugees had a major impact in the areas that welcomed them. I'm not talking about Judaism now. I'm talking about just in general. very famously, Salim II, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1500s, very famously, he says that the Iberian monarchs, they claim to be so smart, they claim to be so whatever. They cannot be that smart because they are sending me their best citizens. They cannot be that smart. It's huge. In the Ottoman Empire, printing presses introduced in the Ottoman Empire by Jews. Printing presses introduced in North Africa by Jews. Printing presses introduced in Israel by Jews, by these refugees. The technology, military technology, in terms of the use of guns and gunpowder and things like that, was a major bonus for the Ottoman Empire with all this know-how that the Portuguese and Spanish refugees took with them. So this was a very important contribution for the areas where they went, not just from a Jewish perspective. So with these, I want to leave you with the idea that yes, the expulsion from Portugal was very different, was very consequential, was a paradigm shift in Jewish history, was the end of an era, and it was the beginning of many other eras. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Can you share your screen, please?
I'm stop sharing.
And you're still spotlighted though.
Remove spotlight.
I will spotlight Mindy Reiser, and she will.
I am no longer the center of your attention.
You were still there. You're still there. Mindy will ask you some questions. It was for me, it was very wonderful, but we'll see what Mindy has.
So just to make sure, I am not spotlighting anything, so I don't know.
No, I'm spotlighting you and
oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Mindy, you are muted.
All right, so many fascinating ways to proceed. Let me first go far back and ask you the fascinating figures. Most of us, I am sure, have not had the opportunity to meet these people. The fascinating and multi-gifted Rabbi Abraham Zacuto. Can you say a little bit, do we know about his religious life? We talked about his scientific life and his gifts in technology and envisioning creative ways of working with the knowledge of the time. What do we know about his religious life?
We know a lot, actually, because he wrote a lot. We know that Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, he ended up actually, we don't know exactly where he died, but there is a good likelihood that he died in Israel, certainly died in the Ottoman Empire. We know that, I know this is not exactly the question that you're asking, but you know that 2 of his children were baptized by force and ended up being able to live. So this also tells you how high the persecutions went. And one of the things that you have to understand right away is that although I phrased all these things, these contributions as scientific contributions, for example, the calendar issues, all the astronomy that he developed, for him, this was not a scientific pursuit. For him, this was developing the knowledge to be able to deal with the calendar, with the Jewish calendar. So he's the original Hebrew version of the Almanac Perpetuum has that slant. Now, because this was such an important thing for the time, this was actually used extensively by Christopher Columbus. And we have records because Christopher Columbus talks about that, about using these. I'll tell you in a second a very interesting story that Christopher Columbus says. And so for Rabbi Zacuto, Astronomy was part of his Jewish writings. Not only that, at the time, there was no difference. People didn't understand the difference between astronomy and astrology. So there was a lot of this idea, knowing where the stars are and the planets as a way of also making astrological inferences. So there was that, as in particular trying to figure out the end of times and the coming of the Messiah, which you can see that people were in such a horrible situation that messianic hopes would make a lot of sense. So all of that was perceived as a religious pursuit. Now, the other contributions, he was also a professor of mathematics and astronomy for a while at the University of Salamanca, because he happened to be in very good terms with the local clergy, big stories. But so he was also a scientist, to whatever extent you consider scientists. And in Portugal, he was the head mathematician, the head astronomer. But he was, more than anything else, he was a rabbi. He was a religious leader. He was mostly interested in religious issues. A lot of these things for him were religious issues, and he has a lot of strictly religious writings. One of his most famous writings is a book that is called the Book of Genealogy, which is actually a book of Jewish history. And it's a fabulous book. It's one of the earliest contributions that give us, look, people can be very ambitious. He gives the history of the world from the beginning to his times. So in the Jewish world, but actually he's not happy enough with the Jewish world only. He wants to give the world history. So it's a very thick book, but again, it's a very it's a very helpful book in terms of telling us a lot of the things that happened to him and so forth. So he is a religious leader more than anything else. His family that goes then to Jerusalem, our family are Jewish leaders there. He is the rabbi. For us, he is Rabbi Zacuto. For the Portuguese crown, he was the chief astronomer. Now, let me tell you a very interesting story about Rabbi Abraham Zacuto. And this is something that is recorded in the chronicles of the voyages of Christopher Columbus. So it's not a Jewish source. It's a Christopher Columbus source. So it tells about an episode where Christopher Columbus claims that the tables from Rabbi Zacuto saved his life and saved the life of the crew. And this is what happened. This is what Christopher Columbus describes. They were lost, which was not that uncommon, okay? And you know that men don't ask for directions, so it's a very famous one. So they were lost. They ended up with some island with natives. And I think this is like what is today the Dominican Republic. And they didn't have any food. And they wanted to get food from, and they were having a hard time, and they thought that they would be either killed or die of starvation and lack of water. So what did Christopher Columbus decide to do? He decided to impress the natives. He describes it this way. How does he impress the natives? He tells them that if they don't give him food and don't let him go right away, he is going to hide the moon. He's going to hide the moon, and the moon is going to disappear. Now, comes to the night. What happens to the moon? The moon disappears. And the natives are scared. They give him everything he wants. They actually are very happy that he can go away and everything. And he explains the only thing that he did was to go to the Abraham Zacuto's Almanac Perpetuum and see that that night there was a full eclipse of the moon. So he knew it because of those tables, and it saved his life. Again, this is his record. This is actually in the Colombian the Colombo Library in Seville. That's, you have not only these chronicles, but you have also the book, the Almanac Perpetuum itself, that Christopher Columbus took with him at the time.
Wow. This is really fascinating. Let me turn to something else, and I think you could probably talk at least for an hour on this. You just mentioned...
Don't try me.
Well, I may. All right. You mentioned that Rabbi Zacuto had good relationships. I think you even used the word friends with some of the clergy who certainly respected him. All right. So how did the clergy feel? And the clergy is not one mass. They're different human beings with different perspectives. But were there factions within the clergy in Portugal that started to say, what are you doing? You talked about, the opposition to expelling Jews. But what about the new Christian business? Did clergy say, this is not a good idea, they're not going to know anything, they're not going to be faithful? Was there repelling by the Catholic clergy themselves for all these ideas for royal reasons that really might not have been of much concern to them?
Although we cannot exclude some isolated cases, and we know cases of people writing chronicles, some of them were clergy, that write in a very compassionate way about Jews and the suffering of the Jews and everything. Even in the case of Portugal, we have later in the middle 1600s, a very famous friar that writes a lot in support of the new Christians and so forth. But we have to understand what this means also, because the idea is not that, the idea is that we should convince them to become Jewish as opposed to forcing them. So it's hardly very favorable to Jews. So even when they decry, oh, these people, these poor people, they are suffering with the children and everything, the comment that follows is, if only they could convert willingly, they wouldn't have to go through this. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that. The other thing that we have to understand is that with such a large Jewish population and such prominence in terms of science and everything else, you have a lot of Jews that are in very high positions. When you are in a very high position, you're treated with some, it's different. It's different. If you are a court Jew, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, it's almost a caste system in some ways. It is what it is, but obviously people were treated differently. Look, the fact is, just to put things in perspective with Rabbi Zakut. Rabbi Zakut, we don't know this from Jewish sources, incidentally. We know this from Christian chronicles, that he is supposed to have met Vasco da Gama, the great explorer, the day before Vasco da Gama left to India to give him advice and give things like that. Okay? Now, this is in June of 97, of 97, I mean to say, 1497. This is already after all these closing of Jewish institutions. This is after basically stealing all the books, confiscating everything. Forced conversions already bulk. This is very late in the game, and he's still being consulted according to them. And he's still, we know that in Spain happened the same thing. The big people like the Abravanel and others, they were allowed to stay. Look, the truth of the matter is that they also thought that they would be able to convince the crown, either through bribery or other ways, to rescind the decrees. That's really their hope. So do we have opposition within? There is some opposition. There was. It's interesting to note that at the time, one of the institutions that was most favorable towards the Jews was actually the Pope, and the Pope at the time, they had the papal states. It was a lot of power. They were a country. It was a country. It was not like it is now, that it's more a symbolic thing. It was a big country, lots of power. And it was part of the power struggle between the Pope as the head of the church and all these, the kings and the dukes and all that type of stuff. Basically, who do the Jews belong to? That was pretty much the... So there were lots of arguments, and some people were actually nice. And I don't want to sound too cynical, but sometimes the feeling that I have when I read these documents is that, yes, they were very careful with Jews, the same way they were very careful with their horses. I mean, it was part of the property. And again, I don't want to be too cavalier or too gross about this, but I'm not sure that it's a different time, and I'm not sure that their pro-Jewish views really came from anything but a very self-centered place. Now, it's better that it comes from a self-centered place than just straight out anti-Semitism. I mean, I would rather have fake friendship than true enemies, right? So that's fine. But yeah. And just to close the thought, there was indeed a very big debate, as I mentioned briefly, at a later date. There was a very big debate that was among different monastic orders about whether or not, again, forced conversions should be recognized. And this was a power struggle. It was mostly a power struggle over who has jurisdiction over the Jews, who has jurisdiction, who's going to keep their property when they are arrested. And it was, again.
Okay. People are interested in connecting this extraordinary story with a direct human reality. In that case, you, who comes from Portugal. And there's interest in telling us, if you wish, whatever you wish, about the chain of your own heritage and how you've learned it and how far back it can take you.
Well, let me answer in an indirect way, and maybe later on in a more direct way. In Portugal proper, these crypto-Judaism, this phenomenon of crypto-Judaism, lasted virtually to these days, to today, virtually. Specifically, there was a major coming out of the closet, let's use that expression, of hidden Jews in the late 1920s and early 1930s in Portugal. It was a very interesting phenomenon.
Why that time? What catalyzed it at that time?
So, well, you can say it's either divine providence or a coincidence. I'll let you choose which one. But what happened at the time was that there was a Polish mining engineer by the name Shmuel Schwartz, who was in business, and he visited some northern areas of Portugal, and he wanted to find some business partners, and people kept on telling him things along the lines, don't do business with that guys because those guys are Jews, and things of that nature. And he decided to investigate. So, I mean, it's an intellectual also, and he actually did a great work trying to figure out these things. So he found out, he discovered these relatively large number, you're still talking about 10, 15,000 people, that were doing some type of Judaism. But again, you have to understand that it's a type of Judaism that we would not recognize as Judaism, as much as they would not recognize our Judaism as Judaism. But that's whatever was left. And at that time, he was able to engage the British communities, and they formed an international committee of inquiry, and there was a lot of support. There was a lot of mixed feelings also, but by and large, at that point, he managed to bring to the Jewish community at large the fact that, oh, look at these guys. They still exist there. They are doing these things. And most people thought it was an incredible thing and tried to help. So at that time, at that particular time, there was a lot of support also financially from England, mostly, but religiously from North Africa. That's where the chief rabbinate was before moving to Israel, the Sephardic rabbinate. And there were a few people, there was in particular one person that is referred by many as the apostle of the Moranos, that is a Captain Barros Bastos, and he was able to really revitalize things and go to talk to people and try to convince people to come out of the closet and learn. And so in the early 30s, you have basically, call it an yeshiva if you want, and an improvised synagogue that is started in Porto and other areas. And people start getting excited, and people come back to mainstream Judaism, which at that stage means a conversion of stringency. I mean, you have to come back to Judaism, but you have to have some type of abbreviated or conversion of some sort because of the discontinuity in time that there is. And towards the middle 30s, you have a big synagogue that is built in Porto, the Mekor Chaim, the Kaduri. It's called also Kaduri Synagogue because it was basically financed by the Kaduri family, the Hong Kong branch of Kaduri family, the British. And this is a beautiful synagogue that exists today, and that's actually the home today of the Porto community. That's a beautiful building. And so there was a major revival. People were very excited. From the United States, the Solopol Foundation, the Solopol family from New York, they were financing books that were being sent, like Sidurim and things like that. It was
which family again?
The Solopol. The Solopol.
Yes.
From Shearit Israel incidentally, it's a story within the story, but Shearit Israel from New York is founded by these Portuguese refugees. And the term Shearit Israel means the remnant of Israel, right? This reflects a lot how they view themselves. But coming back to this story, so all this revival, that was a very wonderful revival of the crypto Jews coming back to mainstream Judaism, literally. It's something that was very badly timed, as I'm sure you can imagine, because you're talking about middle 30s, 1930s and so forth. This is during the period of civil war in Spain. This is right before the beginning of World War II. And to give you a good idea of how bad things got very fast at that time, the synagogue in Porto, the beautiful, huge synagogue, was dedicated. And right after being dedicated, the building next door was donated to the German embassy to be the German school, the Nazi school, and the unofficial headquarters of the Gestapo in Portugal. So that basically means that at that time the movement was completely asphyxiated. Captain Barros Bastos, that was the leader, he was arrested. He was expelled from the army at that point, and he was accused. He was, interestingly enough, he was expelled from the army on grounds of being homosexual. Now, he was not homosexual, but the argument was that you're promoting circumcision, so you got to be homosexual. Don't ask me what the connection is. I don't know, but that was the official indictment, is that he was homosexual because he was promoting circumcision. And basically what happened at that time is towards the late 1930s is that the communities, all this group of people that have come out of the closet, so to speak, throughout the early 30s and so forth, you talk about 10, 15,000 people. these people just went back to the closet as fast as they could. Although now it's, well, the cat is out of the bag. So it's much more difficult. And if you fast forward, of these, there was a very small remnant in one small town in the north of Portugal. And this in the middle 1980s already. My family is around that area, so I was very interested in that, and I did a lot of work with them, trying to bring them back, bring everybody back. I mean, I was lucky to be in the United States, so I had everything at my disposal. But just helping them coming back to the fold, so to speak. But notice, this is now we're talking about a couple of hundred people, a very small group now, but we are also talking about 1987, 88. So at that time, we got a lot of support from Israel, and we managed to bring support, financial and also religious. And so in 1996, 500 years from the expulsion, a new synagogue was dedicated in this small city and small town in the mountains in the north of Portugal. So there was the ripple effects of this in Portugal lasted until now. And so lots of families after the 1930s, they just basically tried to evaporate, tried to disappear. And the families that did not disappear from the radar screen are the ones that were lucky enough to move to other countries. Some moved to Israel, lots moved to Israel, lots moved to America and other places. And so when you go to America or you go to Israel or something like that, then it's a different game. You can just reassert who you are with some freedom and some all the resources that you have.
But your own family.
So my own family is from around this community that I'm talking about now in the 1980s. So it's very, very close to on both my sides of the family.
But was able to, over the years, they were crypto Jews at some point.
Yeah, but again, we have to understand that it's a very nuanced thing. For example, just to put things in perspective and without getting overly personal about these things. When you, I mean, I came to the United States in 1982. This is a few years right after the Portuguese Democratic Revolution. It was the regime in Portugal was a very dictatorial regime, was an authoritarian, some people call it fascist, whatever. But for example, just to give you an idea, until 1974, circumcision was forbidden.
Oh.
Okay. So guess what? I was one of those lucky people that I got circumcised as an adult. You know, such is, and I mean, I can tell you that there is a lot of wisdom in circumcising a baby when the baby is 8 years old, 8 days old, as opposed to 25 years old. There are some advantages of that. But this is just an illustration of the difficulties until 1974. It was really, but after 1974, things opened up a little bit, and that's also why maybe 10 years after that already, those communities that were what was left over felt comfortable coming out again. But what we have to understand in all of this is that for a lot of people that claim these roots, even claiming, like my family did very, very closely, people don't have a very clear notion of what it means. I mean, you have like, it's an intuition, it's something you have in your soul, it's something you have, but what does it really mean? It's like, I remember coming to the United States and my thoughts were, I would say I'm Jewish, but the same way as somebody that has a family that comes from Italy that will say, I'm Italian. I mean, what does that mean? I have an affinity for Italy. Maybe I even like pizza. God knows. But so you have to understand that things don't mean, it's only when you start learning a little bit more about Judaism that things become more meaningful. Because what do you have? You have a very distorted version of Judaism. The connection of most of the people that I related to before coming to the States, and even after that, the connection was mostly with Israel. People were like absolutely fanatics. It's like each time that Israel wins a little battle, I mean, that's party time, you know? So it's Jewish power. It really resonated with people that didn't have any power. But it was much more a cultural thing after a while. You just don't know too much about it. There is no Hebrew, there is no... So it just becomes very diluted, the whole thing. So then it's just a matter of different people feeling more strongly than others, but you still have a fair number of people in Portugal these days that can trace their ancestry in one way or another. Some of them are devout Catholics. Others are trying to find out a little bit more and explore. It's a little bit of everything. Yeah.
We are getting so many entreaties for you to come back and take us deeper into so many of the topics you've mentioned. And you are getting rave reviews, let me tell you. And we have exceeded by a bit the time that we have kept you.
Yeah. But again, remember, I only have my flight tomorrow morning, so I have plenty of time.
Plenty of time, right. Ad Chatzi Halayla, until midnight. Let me turn to Jerry. If there's any last word or two you'd like to say, and I know people may want to get in touch with you directly.
So that's the thing that I would like to say. My email is Shlomo, SHLOMO, at chabadofva.org. If you don't have my email, either you look at Chabad of Virginia, or even better, contact the center and ask for my email, and the center will give you and I will be delighted to answer personal questions or whatever it is. In general, if you are Portuguese speaking, I can speak to you in Portuguese. If you are Spanish speaking, I can speak to you in Spanish. So feel comfortable. I know that there are some people from Portugal and Spain in this forum, or at least they were at some point, which of course begs the question, it's 2 in the morning, what are you doing still waking up? I wake up. But so anyway, so please reach out to me if I can be of any help. I'll be delighted to.
Now, this has been amazingly illuminating with names and experiences none of us have ever heard of. So we are indeed illuminated. Okay, Jerry.
Some of this contact information I will put into the email that goes out to everyone, including whoever's registered, including people who are not necessarily attending, so they can contact you. And there are lots of questions we did not have time to get to, and people can ask their questions and they directly to Rabbi Pereira, Rabbi Shlomo, as I call him, and you know, you can get your answers directly, because we're kind of running out of time right now. I have a couple of questions I want to ask you also, but I won't do it now because it's time time has gone out.
And we know only too well that the questions may be brief, but the answers not necessarily.
The questions will be brief, the answers will not be brief. I understand.
That's the point.
I understand that completely. You've taught me that already.
Yes. I warned you.
You warned, I know. I mean, many years since I was faculty, so I've tried to reform that. Anyway, there will be an email sent out with the information on where the recording is and more information on how to contact Rabbi Pereira, and also about some of his books. Let me ask you one question.
Sneaking it in there.
There have been a couple of questions. I mean, you gave a great presentation about the history of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. Not the whole history, but a lot of it. As I understand it, the books that you've written are more about commentary than this history. I may be wrong about that.
So that's a very good point. What I am doing, what I've been doing over the last few years, and I'm doing now very actively, is doing more and more research on Iberian Jewish history and going as deep as I can with all the information that exists. And that allowed me, for example, to do some wonderful, find wonderful things about one of the most famous early doctors in the United States, Dr. John de Sequeira. It was in Williamsburg in the middle 1700s, a Portuguese Jew, and a great person in medical history in the United States. So there are lots of fabulous things. Specifically, our objective, my objective of my co-author, Rabbi Eli Rosenfeld, who is the Chabad rabbi in Portugal, is to give voice to the Iberian Jews, to give the Iberian Jews of old, to give them voice. There are so many things that were written by these rabbis that people in Portugal and Spain and Portuguese-speaking and Spanish-speaking countries, they don't know because they were written in Hebrew. And those are commentaries on the Torah, those are liturgical books, but they are also filled with historical references. So our objective is literally to give voice to these rabbis of the late 1400s, give or take, to give them voice and use their ideas in their commentaries to highlight, for example, the thoughts on the Torah portion of the week. And we can see, so one of the books, The Jewish Voices from Portugal, is a book that is on all the Torah portions, and we have commentaries of 6 different rabbis from Portugal and Spain of that period. And it's not a translation of what they are saying, it's an adaptation of what they are saying and what it means to us. It's like trying to make them communicate with us and inform us in terms of the Torah portion. That's one of the books. The other is Jewish Ethics, is the same thing on Pirkei Avot. All of them have several books written on commentaries on the ethics of the fathers, and we do the same for the ethics of the fathers. We are in the middle of a project, a couple of projects now, me and Eli Rosenfeld. One is about the Hebrew printing in Portugal. It's not coincidental that I mentioned a little bit about that. Hebrew printing in Portugal in that period is fascinating. It's so innovative. It's so much ahead of its time. And we have a book that should come out relatively soon about that. We are also working on one of the rabbis, specifically Rabbi Abraham Saba from Zamora, that moved to Portugal, and in the city of Guimarães, he wrote a commentary on the Torah. This was around 1493, 94. He, in his commentary on the Torah, the commentary was basically stolen from him, and he had to write it by heart again when he ran away, and he was in North Africa, already in early 1500s, and this book was printed for the first time in Italy in 1523. So it's exactly 500 years ago. So this year, before the end of the year, we are going to have a book, God willing, about the life of Rabbi Abraham Saba and his contributions. But some of his stories are heartbreaking, because, for example, Rabbi Saba, a great rabbi, 2 of his kids were kidnapped and again converted by force. His wife was taken away, converted by force. He never saw them again. He never saw them again. And he writes about his stories. He writes about it. There is one specific rabbi also that lived at that time, Rabbi Yitzhak Karo. And Yitzhak Karo is the uncle of Rabbi Yosef Karo, the big one of the Shulchan Aruch. And that Rabbi Yitzhak Karo, all his family was killed. His children were killed. And he writes a commentary on the Torah, and he calls the commentary of the Torah Toledot Yitzhak, the generations of Yitzhak, which is, of course, a quote from the Torah, the generations of Yitzhak. But he explains, he has a colophon, he has like a note on the front page that says, I am calling this book the Toledot Yitzhak, the generations of Yitzhak, because my generations, my children were taken away from me, were killed. I don't have any progeny. The only progeny that I have to leave to the future generations is my words. So this is my Toledot Yitzhak, this is my progeny. So, and I mean, you have so many of these stories that are so moving in these books and everything. And what we want to do with this is not only inspire the Jewish community, give them voices, give those people a voice to inspire Jews today, but we want to do something else, very important. We want to share all of this experience in a very positive way, share this experience with the Portuguese people, with the Spanish-speaking people in general, because this is part of our common history. It's part of our shared history. This is part of the Iberian experience, and yet people don't know about it.
You know, I hope that these books can get into the hands. I went to a Hebrew day school in New York. I hope what you are doing gets into American.
So let me tell you something that's very, very important. Forgive me, and please don't look at this as anything else but love for that job. This project of sharing these voices from Portugal, from ancient times, from Portugal and Spain, this is something we approached the president of Portugal, and the president of Portugal wrote the preface to the book. Wow. It was very, because this is something, of course, we are writing this for the Jewish community, but we are writing this for everybody. And our attitude about this period is, we know that Jews suffered a lot. We know that, everybody knows that, or should know that. What people don't know is the incredible things that we were accomplishing. I want to talk more about Rabbi Zacuto and the printing and the Barbanels. That's what I want to talk about. That's what we were doing when, forgive me the expression, that's what we were doing when they were trying to kill us. Okay. You see, I don't want to focus on the Inquisition. People already know about that. I want to focus on all the good things that were being done, and there are so many.
You are so universal. My question was about history, but we know you were also, a professor of economics, and you relate a little bit to Portugal with that. But the question about the history, my understanding is you haven't written books about the history except for the Voices of Portugal, but I'm on your mailing list. I get every once in a while, both in my email and also on Facebook, very short episodes about Jewish history of one sort or another. So I would recommend to people who are in the audience to contact Reb Shlomo, get on his mailing list of some sort, and also on Facebook. You will get enormous, great, little, very short episodes. And the episodes in the email are actually not bilingual, but trilingual. English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And they're just wonderful. They're very short, and they're all kinds of different topics.
So by short is about one page.
Yeah, one page. Yeah. Right.
So, and it's very focused, very specific about Jewish experience.
Very interesting. Very interesting stuff. So there's no book that he's written about the history in general.
Not yet.
There's a lot of history that he's written in short pieces.
Yeah. And incidentally, this is a weekly email. I've been doing this for a couple of years already. every week I send an email with that moment. It's called Moment in Jewish History.
When I first got on your Facebook friend, I started getting some of this stuff. That was great. And now I get the emails. It's even more wonderful. So anyway, I know we took much more time than we had said, but there will be an email coming out, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the email. And Rabbi Pereira will probably be back sometime, and we'll continue a little bit.
Very good. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes, Chabad of Richmond, and I used to live in Richmond. I used to visit Chabad. I wasn't Chabad, but I knew the Chabad people pretty well. Okay, so I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all your questions, but I will give you the contact information, and you will find enormous information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we have another class in 3 weeks about the Catskills. Very different. I'm from the Catskills myself, and you all get some email about that also. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Sorry, we're to get to all your questions.
Bye.